African slaves into the colonies. And so when you hear the 1619 Project, don't immediately get defensive because people want to talk about the beginning. Think about the Mayflower a year later in its beginning. And think about the people who rode, who were in that ship and their conditions in that ship. Whether they were chained, whether they knew the outcome of that journey, were they afraid? What was their experience? Would they ever go home again? Would they ever see their loved ones? And so when we talk about ships, you know, I'm usually very good at speaking. I'm used to teaching students. And there go my notes. I really got to ad-lib now. But what has me most nervous today is that my wife is here. And I keep looking at her. Because she would say, if you're going to talk about Amistad and talk about, you know, the Mayflower, then talk about the Clotilda, which sits in Mobile Bay today. And it too was smuggling Africans, but not into Cuba, but into America. And it was in 1860. And so when you think about slavery, and you think about emancipation, and all the efforts at abolition in Connecticut, think about gradual emancipation, and try to decipher what it means. You'd have to go pretty deep to figure out that it was a scheme to keep from having to pay people from taking their property. And so when you tell me that slavery ended in Connecticut in 1784, I say, no, slavery ended in 1848. Because that is when Connecticut finally abolished slavery outright, and there were still people living as slaves in Connecticut in 1848. That's not going to be in your history books. But this next generation, my children learned about Amistad in school. I didn't. I learned about Amistad because a girl in the projects where I lived named her baby Senke. And I was like, what kind of name is that? And she had an afro and her boyfriend had a dashiki. I was like, what they smoking? I saw roots, but I was like, what's going on here? I didn't know that later on it would revisit me in a way that I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. But I needed to feel that to understand what we were covering up. And so you cannot resolve trauma unless you resolve it. You come to grips, you reconcile, you confront the horrors of your past. And so what we do in the Black community, we pray, we sing, we dance, and then we have a feast. And we do that in difficult times as well.
Yes.
We don't call it a funeral. We call it a homegoing celebration. Because we understand the endurance that it takes. And so when we talk about Amistad and we talk about Juneteenth, like Juneteenth is kind of cool. Because it happens on Father's Day.
Yes, sir.
And I would be remiss to say that I want to thank my wife because she's the reason I am a father. You know, and my father-in-law, who will be 84 next week in Alabama, he got up this morning, he fed the chickens, brought a few eggs in, tended the garden, kissed his wife, had some coffee. This is his daily ritual. He has endured more than I ever will, and yet he is still a positive person with a positive outlook because each generation gives hope to the future. And so Juneteenth is really about freedom. How many of you know how many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners? 41 of 56. How many of you know why Connecticut is called the Constitution State? It's on every license plate, but you drive around or you walk around and you don't know it. And so when we talk about this history, we have to tell the whole story. And when we look from the perspective of today, we can't pretend like it was so long ago. Slavery was a long time ago. Why are you using that as an excuse? And so these social determinants of health that contribute to the disparities in housing that you're going to hear about, in education that you're going to hear about. And Dr. Canty, y'all just don't get this. This is different, y'all. This is impressive. This is Ivy in UConn. and some stuff y'all don't understand. But y'all have heard terms like mortality, comorbidity. You heard it in the context of the pandemic, but you're going to hear it in the context of nursing and being a midwife. My wife is from Alabama. We met at a black college in Alabama, Alabama State University. Proud, you know, because my family is from Selma, Alabama, and I appreciate that history. But being from Alabama opens your eyes to your own state. And the first thing you start to say is, we ain't as bad as them. Like we're two different Americas. No, we're one. We're one. When we work collectively, we're the best one we can be. And so Juneteenth is about recognizing the pain and discussing its impact still today. And so you're going to hear about education. I'm from the justice system. I deal with pain every day. I see people's pain as they come through. And you still have to offer them hope. But you're going to hear about housing. You know, when they told me I was coming here, the first thing I thought was, do I have to pay to get in? How much it costs to park? Because y'all know y'all beach communities don't really like folks showing up. You know, y'all charge $800 for parking. You call it fair. You know, so when Ned Cole was running around in the 70s bringing black kids to the beaches, scared folks. Got 169 towns in this state. 24 of them have beach access. And so one of the panelists is going to speak to some of the exclusions. How did Connecticut become so segregated? By chance? Or was there government involvement? Housing policies and law. You're going to hear about those things. Education. We have an outstanding panel today. An outstanding panel. I come at it from the perspective of law. And so there's three major law cases that come to mind. The Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, which says that you are property and I can go into a free state and retrieve you and bring you back. They came to Connecticut to get us, y'all. They did. Congress said it was okay. When you declare independence, you've done nothing. I can declare myself a bird. Unless I fly up out of here, you don't have to believe it. If you proclaim something, you've done nothing. When you declare independence, it's because you're ready to fight for your freedom. But you fought for your freedom. And so Frederick Douglass said it best. To the American slave, what is your 4th of July? Well, we have Juneteenth. We still love the 4th of July. Okay. We still love the 4th of July. I'm going to have these guys introduce themselves. You have their wonderful bios in the program. We're going to have Dr. Canty, then Fanula, and then my man Kendrick introduce themselves and give you an overview of their topic. And then we're going to come back at the end with questions and then questions for the audience. Dr. Canty.
Thank you, and I'm honored to be here. History is so important. I am a nurse midwife. I'm currently an associate professor at UMass Amherst. Going into education was an unintended road for me. I knew I wanted to work clinically and then just fell in love with teaching. But there was another role that I was not expecting, and that was to become a historian. And I became an historian because I wanted to understand health disparities. I wanted to understand why there were differences just based on race. So that was an unintended road for me, but something that I love, and that led me to become a reproductive justice advocate. And it was my own research that I want to understand, why are Black women more likely to die? And that was a question that I was so confused about. And when I started to ask the question, I heard, well, they have a lot of diseases. They start prenatal care late. They don't care, they don't know how to take care of their bodies. They're poor, they're uninsured. But when I started to do my own research, I found a different story. I found that you could start prenatal care early. You could not miss one appointment. You could live in some of the wealthiest areas. You could have a doctorate degree. You could even be Serena Williams. And you can still die in this country from a childbirth-related condition. With all the technology and money that we spend, it doesn't protect our black women. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die compared to white women. Indigenous women are twice as likely to die. And these numbers are startling. And I can put numbers on this. They say, and I'll start with 2020. They say that it was an estimated 18.2 per 100,000 women died in the United States from a childbirth-related cause. And keep in mind that 60% of these deaths are preventable. When you look at white women, they were just about at that average, about 18.2. And then you look at Hispanic women, and they were 19 per 100,000. Black women were 55.2 per 100,000. So you can see how the disparities exist. So these numbers were shocking and surprising to me. And when I want to understand, but why? Why is this happening? I had to go back to the very beginning. I went all the way back to slavery to try to understand. And what I found was that, first of all, the medical establishment was there during slavery, at the very beginning. They were there during the Middle Passage, examining black bodies to determine if they were strong enough, healthy enough to work long hours. So the women were examined to see if they can have children. Can you imagine that? So that's where the medical establishment kind of started in this. And then when we look at insurance companies putting a price on the black body, and it doesn't stop there. We start to look at medical experimentation, how bodies are used to educate. And we realize that when we're in these systems, brown and black people don't have control over their bodies. You think the science is to help, but when you think about the harsh realities of how, for example, Dr. Marion Sims used the black body to experiment and perfect his GYN surgeries. He did obstetrical surgeries on black slaves and did not use any anesthesia and perfected his technique. Techniques that are still being used today. He developed instruments that are still being used today. So I'm going to tie in just a couple other things I want to mention, and then I want to tie in slavery in those times to what's happening now. COVID-19 really shined a light on the issues that exist, not just with access to care, but access to quality care. Think about those who went in for care who had a cough, and we knew it was all over the news that COVID existed. And because they weren't believed because of their symptoms, they were sent home, and they spread COVID to their families and their communities. Some of them didn't even make it back to the hospital. They died en route or they died at home. So just to let you know that just because we have access to care doesn't mean we're going to get the care that's free from racism and discrimination. So it still exists. And people always say, well, how does that tie in with slavery? But just think about during those times when they were differentiating black and white, that they were racializing, that they actually even they even made black being a disease. Blackness was a disease. And then what came along with that is they tried to use science that wasn't even real to say that we can't feel pain, that we don't understand our bodies, that we're not smart enough to understand our bodies. I found a very early textbook that said, black women don't have pain after they have a cesarean. And this is over 100 years ago. And unfortunately, we're still practicing that today, where black women aren't believed for their pain. So they come in with symptoms of a serious complication. And I can tell you a true story of a woman who went in with chest pain and was told, oh, you just have a little angina, go home and rest. Another doctor stopped her. She was in heart failure. She had to be admitted to the hospital for 10 days in the ICU. And they said, we're gonna try to prolong your life. She's like, who tells a 28-year-old female who considers herself healthy, we're trying to prolong your life? So I just want you to see, and this is not something that happened 200, 300 years ago. This happened last year in Connecticut. So these stories are still happening, and I always think about, what about those women who went home and said, oh, I'll just rest, and they never woke up? So I just want you to see and understand how deep this goes, and a lot of it originated from slavery. And today, I know because of time, today, I'm willing to answer questions related to that, but I just want to give an overview of what my research involves. And it's just having people to be aware. When I learned my history, it was painful, but learning my history and talking about it also gave me hope. because now we're shining a light. So now how do we move forward from where we're at? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Canty. Our next presenter, Fionn Darby-Hudgens. Darby-Hudgens, I'm sorry. I told her I wasn't going to blow her name that day, so I apologize for that. She's a homegrown, and her story is also impressive in terms of academia and the research that she's done, and traveling through the community colleges and graduating from Trinity College, which is small ivy in my backyard, and that's a beautiful thing. And so, Fionn, if you can share with the audience kind of an overview of some of the housing issues and how they connect to slavery, and particularly past laws around housing.
Sure. So thank you so much again for this opportunity to be here today. I feel like I have learned more in the last 40 minutes than I have going to be bringing to this conversation, so it's really just truly a privilege. So as Attorney Johnson shared, I manage a civil rights nonprofit in Hartford where we represent victims of housing discrimination. We represent about 1,500 individuals a year, and those are all individuals who live in Connecticut. So these are issues we're facing today, and I think just like my colleague Dr. Canty suggested, these are not issues of our past, right? And so I came to this intersection of really sort of thinking about housing and researching housing history and land use policies, right? Because I went to college as a very young white woman thinking I was going to save urban education, right? I was going to go into the schools and I was going to save urban education. And I spent a year in the Hartford public school system, and I realized there was not going to be much I could do unless I changed housing. Because we live in a state and we live in a country where your zip code defines your outcomes. We refer to this in the housing world as zip code destiny, right? And there is no greater indicator of your life outcomes than where you live. And they connect to your access to education, they connect to your access to healthcare, they connect to your access to transit, access to quality infrastructure, right? Access to fire and public safety, right? And we also live in one of the most segregated states in the country. All right, so let that settle in for just 1 minute, and let's put some context into this conversation, because we are also sitting in one of the most white communities in Connecticut. So Connecticut is more segregated than Mississippi, it is more segregated than Alabama, it is more segregated than Florida. Right? And when you look at black-white segregation, it is even hyper-segregated, right? Our MSAs in Connecticut, Hartford, New London, Bridgeport, New Haven, are in the top 10 most segregated MSAs in the country. And that was not an accident, right? So that's people, white people, made choices about how we plan our communities, and some of those choices are being made today. Right? So I would encourage all of you folks, especially the ones that live locally, to start getting involved in your land use laws, right? There is no place more contentious than discussing affordable housing in Stonington, Connecticut. Okay? And because we have built a state and built a nation that determines how Americans build wealth is through housing and through land use, and then we exclude housing development from wealthy communities. We are excluding an entire population of people. We are excluding people of color from access to generational wealth. And so that is how I came here, and this is what I continue to do. I've spent about a decade researching how historic land use policies and historic housing policies have built the most segregated state in the country. And I don't know, I've heard a lot today that our history is messy, and as a white person, I'm not sure it's messy, I think we're afraid to tell it. Right? And I think that we're afraid to listen to it, and I would just encourage to really sink in and really start thinking about even what your own communities are doing and saying today.
Presenter, or third presenter, soon to be Dr. Kendrick Roundtree, is the reason I accepted the invitation to serve as the moderator of the panel. And told him, it's like, it had nothing to do with you, man. I know your mother-in-law. He's a warrior. I don't say no to warriors. But imagine the Connecticut education system had Prudence Crandall succeeded in opening her school. Imagine the Connecticut education system if the college in New Haven that was planned in 1831 for black people was opened. We wouldn't be talking so much about Yale because we'd have scholars from this black institution in the nutmeg state. And so when we talk about access to education, when we talk about zip code, there's some phenomenal things that are happening, but it's a collective effort. So this next speaker describes himself as unapologetically dedicated to helping folks get to college. And I just met you, brother, and you're my hero.
So if I may, the actual quote is, I am unapologetically dedicated to helping students of color graduate from college. So I won't take up a lot of time right now because I'm going to take up a whole lot of time later. But slavery and education are absolutely connected, and we're seeing some of that play out in real time. Right now, as we speak, there are a lot of conversations from certain segments of the population talking about critical race theory and what it is and what it is not. Spoiler alert, critical race theory is not taught in any K-12 education, and it is not taught in undergraduate education. It is almost exclusively taught in law school. But much like other things, there are people who are trying to co-opt that phraseology and use it against people. But also what the real thing is, it's trying yet again to vanish black and brown people and the history that they have contributed to in this nation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We had a little bit of foreshadowing. Just by show of hands, how many people know what an HBCU is? So about half. For the other half, HBCUs are historically black colleges and universities. Many of them were started with land grants in the mid-1800s. The largest creation of the HBCUs happened immediately after the end of the Civil War. But there were a couple of institutions that were founded and created pre-Civil War. And one of those colleges was supposed to start right here in Connecticut. And that college that was supposed to start here in Connecticut was going to be erected in New Haven, Connecticut. And if you think about the college town or the college section of New Haven, we tend to think immediately about Yale University. Yale University was one of the primary squashers of the HBCU movement happening here in Connecticut, right? So part of what I'm going to do today is not necessarily talking these broad overtones about history, but I'm going to bring a lot of stuff right back here to our backyard, because the stuff that is happening here in our backyard is very complex. Some of it is exactly what is going on in other parts of the state, parts of the country, but some of it is very, very unique to Connecticut. Depending on the metrics you use, Connecticut has either the second or third largest achievement gap, or what is called the achievement gap, in the nation. What that means is white communities have much better access resources than black communities. There's a reason for that. Some of that, and I'm sure Fionn is going to talk about this a little bit, is the way that our highways were erected here in the state. It's very purposeful. Where I-91 and I-84 meet, there's a very specific reason that highway splits certain communities and makes them separate from each other. None of this is done by accident. All of it is done by design. A system cannot protect those it was never intended to. So I'll stop right there, and we can get the panel rolling.
My first question is for Dr. Canty. There's a statement that the most healthy communities.
Can't hear you.
Sorry.
You guys should just speak into the microphone.
All right, I turned it off. You want to hear my stomach growl? Where's that barbecue, y'all, right? That the most healthy communities are the most wealthy communities. And so money matters. Dr. Canty, do you think that money is the only thing that drives patient care when it comes to how Black people are treated or how they're perceived by medical providers?
So, and that's an important question. And when you look at race and you look at, socioeconomic status, and in certain communities, if you see, for example, in the white community, the more money you make and where you live, if you're living in a wealthier community, your health is better. Your access to resources are better. You get those specialists right away. You have resources to even travel to New York City for the top treatment if you can, because you have those financial resources. But what we're seeing in the Black community, and I'll speak particularly about Black women during pregnancy, is the more that you make, it makes no difference. So someone who has a high 100, let's say they have a six-figure salary, has the same health outcomes as someone who's unemployed. One of the most kind of things that were difficult to understand, because we say also the more education you have, that your health is better. But a Black woman with a PhD is 5 times more likely to die than a white person who's a high school dropout. And because we're so afraid as far as research to look at that, we still don't understand. But it kind of makes me think about even when I show up, even if I go to CVS, I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt, someone's gonna be following me around. It doesn't matter that I plan to pay cash for what I have. And if there's something that I need, I have the resources to get it. Someone's following me around. So it's the same thing when you enter the healthcare system. And I've experienced this myself as a nurse. As a PhD prepared nurse, I go into the setting, and at first it's like, oh, she's just gonna be complaining, or they try to talk quick, or they try to talk down to me. And then I don't tell them right away I'm a nurse, because I want you to treat me based on who I am as an individual first. But when I start using the language, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, she knows what a colonoscopy is. She knows what cytology means. She knows what a mammogram is supposed to look at, and you can see the dynamics change. But sometimes there's some providers that see that, and it makes them more aggressive towards how they treat you. So unfortunately, it doesn't make a difference because we're so conditioned to how race is supposed to look in our country, in Connecticut. It's unfortunate because it's like there's nothing that genetically predisposes me to hypertension, to diabetes, to die during childbirth, to COVID. But I'm more likely to die. I'm less likely to get breast cancer or cervical cancer, but I'm more likely to be diagnosed later, and I'm more likely to die. And it's unfortunate, it all boils down to race. And what people even ask, when I go in, even the education a provider provides to me is sometimes based on race. My treatment options, I'm only told one thing when someone could go in the same socioeconomic status, education, and they're saying, well, you could do this or you could do that. Or you know what, I'm not in the office on Saturdays, but I'll come in just for you. So there's a difference, and that's the difference that we see when we look at the health outcomes. So we have to look behind the numbers. And I just have to say one last thing is race doesn't place me at risk for dying. Racism places me at risk for dying.
Say that again, please.
Race does not place me at risk for dying. Racism places me at risk for dying.
Wow.
And so, as our panelists have said a few minutes ago, that there will be opportunities to engage for questions and answers. In a few minutes, we're going to have what we refer to as the Harambe ceremony. And that's where we'll have an opportunity to talk to each other. If you have questions, you will have an opportunity to share the questions or comments, or we also will have cards that will circulate. So just in case you don't want to share the questions or comments, you will certainly be able to write them down. So at this point, we're going to have a special treat for you. and that is Nia Arts, as well as Have Drum Will Travel, are going to do a cultural dance for you.
and go home to my Lord and be free. Come on.
Despertador, e caminhadum de calada, trabalhador, despertador. Filho de barata, que babodi, vai bem animar. Filho de barata, que babodi, vai bem animar. E caminhadum de calada. Trabalhador, despertador, e caminhador de calada. Trabalhador, despertador, e caminhador, trabalhador, despertador, e caminhador, trabalhador. Pra ser feliz, e camarina, na busca bom, pra ser feliz. Filho de Bernarda, que vai ouvir, vai bem animar. Filho de Bernarda, que vai ouvir, vai bem animar. E camarina, e camarada, trabalhador, respeitador, e camarina, está bom, pra ser feliz. Filho de barata, que vai morrer, vai bem animar. Filho de barata, que vai morrer, vai bem animar. E camarina, e camarada, trabalhador, e camarina, e camarina, e camarina, busca bom, fácil. passei família, e camarina, a busca pão, passei mulher. Eu, filho de Bernarda, que vai ouvir, vai bem me mal. Eu, filho de Bernarda, que vai ouvir, vai bem me mal. E camarada, e galera, trabalhador, despertador, e camarada, trabalhador.